I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Joining me today is a lifelong friend and supporter of CSS, whose record speaks to the values that are vital in addressing the needs of the very poor and the working poor. Representative Charles Rangel is the Dean of the New York State Congressional Delegation, now serving his 16th term. Congressman Rangel's Manhattan District covers the communities of East and Central Harlem, the Upper West Side, Washington Heights, and Inwood. He is the ranking member of the Committee on Ways and Means and Deputy Democratic Whip of the House of Representatives. Charlie, thank you for joining us here.
Good to be here, and thank you for all the good work that you and CSS has been doing over the years.
Thank you very much. Well, we've just finished the first 100 days of the Bush administration. What's it mean for people in the city of New York, and particularly in the inner city?
I get the feeling all over the country that America is just so happy that Bush has not fallen just flat on his face. The expectations has been so very, very low from the campaign to the so-called victory that when you ask people, how do you explain his favorable ratings? They say, well, look at it this way. 3/4 of America that could vote didn't vote for him. Right. Half didn't vote for anybody, and they're just embarrassed by some of the things that he has done, and just feel blessed that he just hasn't been the bull in the china closet.
So a unique honeymoon, basically, that he's having now.
A very unique, and then too, I'm glad you mentioned the word honeymoon, the anti-Clinton thing, which has to be a white thing, because I don't understand it. You know, it has to be a sudden white thing. I think Hillary probably misspoke when she said conspiracy, because it makes it appear as though there was a meeting. But there was no meeting. He's been at the Target, hanging around with black folks, and coming from an alcoholic family, doing all these anti-English, well-bred things that white Southerners would want. But they had to make certain that they got the firing shots at him, which of course diverted attention away from Bush. But it may be that Bush has the meanest group of people around him, even far going beyond the Nixon-Reagan thing. And the way I looked at it, none of the mean-spirited Republicans that I have known since Newt Gingrich took over played any role at all in the Bush campaign. You couldn't see them on television. You didn't see them at the convention. And that was extraordinary, because most people want to be associated with him. And I think you might agree that Bush sounded more like a Democrat sometimes than Gore did.
Yep.
But the gang behind him, they're in charge today, and they are mean.
Well, in that vein, of course, the tax cut and the magnitude of that represents the first take on this. Why should people in our audience be concerned about a tax cut?
Well, first of all, there's so much talk about a surplus that one would think that America is just the wealthiest country in the world in terms of the balance sheet. But you start using this language, and it's misinformation. The fact is that we owe $3, $4, $5 trillion, depending on how you look at our obligations. That's what we owe. I don't care what we owe. I owe money. I don't care what I owe. What really bothers me is the interest that I'm paying on what I owe. And when the interest that you're paying far exceeds some of the programs that you're trying to fund and improve, then you have to catch yourself. And for years, the Reagan people, when they had the Soviet Union, would spend billions of dollars in defense, missile protection system, which we hear coming back, and then spend money which you didn't have, which meant an increase in the interest. So when it came time to deal with the programs of education and health,
nothing left.
The money wasn't there. So the Clinton administration, and I like to say, and 52 Democrats who were no longer in the Congress that were defeated because they had the courage to support Clinton, the Clinton budget, which included what? A tax increase.
Right.
And even though that spun us out of deficit spending and allowed us to have a better cash flow, they're no longer here. Now comes the Bush administration, and they actually say, get that money out of Washington. If you don't,
they'll spend it.
They, including Republicans, are going to spend it. Now, why would they say they when the Republican leadership is there? And the answer is basically this. Even Republicans don't know how to dismantle Social Security. Even Republicans don't know how to dismantle Medicare. Why? Because it seemed like they are American-type programs. Well, why were they able, even with Clinton, to be so successful with welfare? Because they colored it. They made it Latino. They made it black. They made it appear as though these were people who could work that wouldn't work. And while they were doing all of this, they could have reformed the system without getting rid of it. But as you and I talk, if you were to ask, well, where do we go next year? What do you mean, we? It's a state program.
Sure.
Yeah, but in America, you couldn't just leave the states out there. I said, well, some money will be given to the states to continue the state programs. But what makes it so different, Rangel, between this year and last year? Last year, there was a mandate for the Congress, like there's a mandate for Social Security. This year, poor folks and governors will now go to the Appropriations Committee and compete for that money. And I'm telling you, David, this tax cut means that if you, and they're coming back with another $1 trillion, and they're coming back with another $1 trillion after that, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but it means that the Social Security system, and that's another $1 trillion, that'll be $4, has to go, according to them, to the private markets. Of all of the years to be saying that,
when
that
you're
old
seeing a
folks
decline,
should be invested in the market. And when you talk about health care, they will tell you, give the for-profits an opportunity to do it, the same way they do with education and challenging the public system. Give the for-profits a chance to do it. And so they've laid it all out. And the only way they can do this and dismantle is not to have the money there so that people like me will have to decide whether we're going to raise taxes to save these programs or whether we just say, hey, we can't take that risk again. We want leadership. We want our members elected. We'll just cut back a little. That's where we are.
What we're talking about, if it's that profound, obviously, there's going to have to be a national movement to push this back. It can't be done just by an individual person in the House of Representatives or the Senate.
And I think we'll have that. And the reason I do is because you just don't have this welfare mother running around in a pink Cadillac that won't work like Ronald Reagan had to beat up on. Now you got old folks that need prescription drugs. Right. You got middle-class people that want to send their kids to school. You have everybody with a horror story about how they went to the health maintenance organization and the clerk told them you're not entitled to that. Right. And I think more and more Americans realize that we don't even have America knowing that the Social Security system, boy, one of the beautiful things about getting old is that all of the things you didn't understand before, age makes you understand.
Absolutely.
And the Social Security system isn't just a pension check or a supplement to a pension check. It's a survivor's type of insurance policy. It's a disability insurance policy.
And we see it, people living on fixed Social Security, what a pitiful existence that is as a sole source. It's not
that's right.
fair.
But if you snatch that away and tell people to go to the private sector, where could they get that type of insurance? And so I do believe, our problem is this guy is moving so fast and cutting so many things all at the same time that, and we don't have the mic, we don't have the podium, we don't have the the ability to get our message out the same way. But I think when the churches, and I know they got to give me a hard time, St. Peter's got to say, why did you always beat up on the churches and the temples and the synagogues? And I say because inside I'm a very religious person, and I believe when you go around talking about what would God want me to do, what would Jesus do now, and Jesus said that, hey, it ain't the rich guy, it's how you treat it, the least among us. Mm-hmm. And with all of the good work that the church is doing now, and the federal government is tempting them with the 30 pieces of silver in saying the faith-based organizations, you back off of these Democrats and we'll give you a couple of bucks extra, that sooner or later they will realize that there is a responsibility of government to try to bring everyone up. And that's where I think the revolution will take place.
We'll be back to continue our program right after this message.
You don't have to like me.
Or you can.
You don't have to run with me.
You really don't have to run away from me.
And we're not all that different.
I like good food. Good music. I want a good job.
I want my kids to live in a world
where they are safe and loved.
And respected for who they are.
You don't have to like me. But if you talk to me...
You might.
We can end prejudice if we talk to each other.
Call. Tell us what you'd do.
Together we can build one America.
Welcome back to the CSS Urban Agenda. I'm David R. Jones. We are honored today to have with us Congressman Charles Rangel. Congressman, we already are starting to hear the returns that about 70,000 people in the state of New York alone are going to lose their welfare entitlements at the end of in December. What does it look like? The Congress has to deal next year, 2002, with reauthorization of the welfare bill. Where do you see this going?
Well, let's see whether we know what we're talking about. One of the biggest fights I had with Bill Clinton during his campaign and during his presidency was this talk about changing welfare as we know it. Sounds so popular, you know, get these people off of welfare. Well, we all wanted to give welfare mothers and welfare fathers an opportunity to get the training and to get the jobs and to have the self-respect and dignity that we felt that they wanted. So certainly we all had to be for welfare reform. But what came with this welfare reform was a cutting of the legal and biblical cord of these programs from the federal government, with people who traditionally feel that the federal government shouldn't be involved in any social programs, that it's local and state. You don't like where you live, you vote with your feet, but the federal government should not be involved. So as you and I talk, because of the governors and because of the Giulianis, the federal government has no obligation to deal with welfare. And I would like to hear an advocate say that we do. It's a state program. Now, we did appropriate monies for the state to run these programs, matching monies. As a matter of fact, we gave them more money if they drove, well, if the people got off of the welfare programs. And we didn't mandate that they had to use all of the federal government's money for the welfare programs. So good times and incentives to keep people off of welfare and not providing information for people who were eligible to get the benefits that you would get in going from welfare to the workplace, the program on paper looked like it has been tremendously successful. So the Congress has to look at now where will the governors be coming from. One thing is clear, they're not going to be asking for less money. They're going to be asking for more money to do more, to have more flexibility to do these things. So we in the Congress will have to ask questions, and I hope, well, it's great. We love the statistics that these people are for welfare. Where are they? Mm-hmm. How many are working? How many are working below the poverty line? Can we make these people, take them and their children out of poverty? Or is this just a question of how many people can we drop off of the rolls? Could we convert this to an anti-poverty type of program where people can be trained and be productive?
And that's exactly what we're starting to discover. It fits exactly in New York City and New York State. Only about a quarter of people who have come off the rolls apparently have moved even a little bit better off economically. The vast majority, 2/3 or more, have either lost ground or are just hanging on by their fingertips.
And we see with those people that provide food and clothing that there's been a sharp increase in the number of people that have been going to these not-for-profit social organizations. I leave here, and I'll be meeting with a group of business people that have joined in with local and state governments to help train these people and to hire welfare people. And I guess is my hope that with all of the political problems that I have with Bush and the Republicans, that American business people would see that this is not do-good talk, you know, that I'm talking about what's good for American, what's good for our economy, what's good for our productivity, what's good for our international trade, what's good for economic growth. And I see you and I see your father, the judge, and I remember going to school and being counseled by, you know, I didn't know any lawyers, any black lawyers in my neighborhood, but I adopt anything black from any neighborhood. He was from Brooklyn. And here I am in Lenox Avenue without a high school education, but worse than that, without any hope.
Right.
That's the worst thing. And I see this black guy, he became a lawyer, and I figure, what the hell, maybe I can become a lawyer after all. My grandfather was an elevator operator in the criminal court building. He knew lawyers. And I try to get the private sector to understand that that's all you have to plant with kids. They don't have to end up on drugs. They don't have to go to jail. You don't have to carry this heavy burden of paying $84,000 a year for a kid. Why can't you start saying that you're going to start with that public school system as you're reaching out now saying, I'll help you with these welfare people? Because during the war, and all wars, for the first time America found out that women could work, that black folks could work, that minorities could fire a rifle. And now that we're becoming a minority country, looking more like the United Nations, looking more like the World Trade Organization, why can't business say, and we're going to use every color, every culture, and every talent we have?
In a sense, some of their resistance seems the discomfort with the very fact that the demographics of the country are changing so rapidly. I mean, there's a fight obviously brewing on the horizon. Maybe, you know, we won't see it all. But as this country fully becomes more black, brown, and Asian, are people ready to make it work?
Well, it seems as though in this country that capitalists are really probably the less bigoted people in the world, that as long as the money is there,
it doesn't matter the color.
It doesn't matter.
Which is certainly something to be...
and so if you're working for a capitalist and they said that we got to trade with sub-Saharan, he said, well, where is that? In Africa. Well, why do we have to do that? Because the money's there. And saying, guess what, O'Reilly, what? You're going to have to go and represent us there.
Early on in my career, I was a lawyer at a large corporate firm, and one of the clients I worked on a case for was Shell Oil. And their attitudes towards the Nigerian were light years above some of the... Yeah. They had already moved on.
And that's a point. If you remember, during the height of racism in the South, a turban could get you a free pass because somehow it was only against those that came from the slaves. But if you came directly from Africa, you got a free pass.
Let me change the subject somewhat. We're about to come into a redistricting of the Congress. There's an issue. Obviously, New York is to lose 2 congressional seats. But New York City and the districts around New York City have grown incredibly. We're up to more than 8 million as a state, but almost all the growth occurred in New York City and environs. Yet we're hearing that there's some sharing agreement that's being discussed, where the Republicans upstate will lose 1 seat and the Democrats downstate will lose 1 seat to sort of balance this out. What's going on here?
That would be wrong.
We've heard this before.
Especially since I'm from downstate.
Yes, I figured.
First of all, they can do anything they want if they think they can get away with it. Mm-hmm. But always watching over them are the courts. And the courts have no sense of continuity of people's culture or background or parties. The courts just blindfoldedly can chop up and cause more political pains for Republicans and Democrats that will force the Republicans and the Democrats in Albany, in the state legislature, to try to work this thing out. Now, while it is abundantly clear that the population growth, even though it hasn't kept up with the rest of the country, that we will lose 2 congressional seats, we will gain 3 or 4 assembly seats, and we will gain a Senate seat, because they can't distort these lines to such an extent that on the local level that we would not take advantage of that. However, I really, truly believe that no matter how much they would want to say, 1 from downstate, 1 from upstate, 1 from the city, and 1 from a north part, or 1 Republican and 1 Democrat, they would have to distort their thinking so much to take a seat away from the city that I think the major battle is going to be which Republican and which Democrat outside the city of New York.
With one closing question, you've been in the Congress for 16 terms, more than 30.
Some would say I've now become what I went down there to fight.
Well, you've seen many transformations in the Congress and where we are as African Americans, a whole range of things. What do you take as the sort of direction you've seen? What are the positives, for instance, that you see coming about, and what do you think the challenges for the next generation of leadership is going to be?
Well, you mentioned earlier, is America ready for the internationalization that has taken place in the world, and certainly the demographics in our country? And while I said that capitalism seemed to be the leveling factor, I could also have said that in the Congress, a vote really equalizes you to anybody that you come there as a freshman, you have the same vote as the speaker. And the civil rights movement, which gave to the person their constitutional right to vote and the access to vote, even though I do believe we've had a tremendous setback in the last election where the Supreme Court can now appoint presidents, but it has caused in the South an explosion of African American candidates and a change of the complexion entirely of the Democrats. Even though the Republicans are so far behind that I jokingly tell J.C. Watts, the black Republican, and Ben Gilman, the Jewish Republican, that if they were defeated, it would wipe out the black and Jewish caucus in one swoop, just 2 people. But if you take a look at the Democratic side, you could be in the World Trade Organization, you could be in the UN, because we got 38 African-American men and women. We got 19 Hispanics, and that number keeps growing. So if you love that flag, and you love the Constitution, and you love the Congress, and you love the House, you're going to have to study us and get along with us. And I think that is the greatest thing, because it's ignorance and fear more than anything. I mean, friendships, especially in the South, to see whites and blacks from the same region have a better relationship than whites and blacks from the North. It's because they have more of a cultural tie and more of a background tie. And I think that you're going to see what Dave Dinkins called the New York City gorgeous mosaic develop in the House of Representatives.
My thanks to Congressman Charles Rangel. There are so many issues that are critical to poor communities in New York and throughout our nation. Leaders such as Charlie Rangel give the concerns of the urban poor a fighting chance to be heard, even in these times of rampant conservatism. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Thank you for joining us for the Urban Agenda. Thanks a lot.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.